Can you really love one person yet end up in bed with someone else? It's a question I never thought I'd have to confront. My wife, Caroline, and I had built a life that anyone might envy. 2 kids, a cozy home in Oak Ridge, a steady job at the precinct. We'd been through enough that I felt I knew her inside out. There was never a reason to doubt her or feel suspicious. Yet, if I'm being honest, our intimacy was the one area that had grown strained over the years, though I brushed it off as the natural result of time passing. It was on a Friday afternoon that things began to unravel. I had to swing by the precinct to drop off a file at headquarters, a boring errand for a police officer sidelined to desk duty. It wasn't the fieldwork I was used to, but after a shooting incident with my partner, internal affairs had us both filling out reports until they closed the review. We'd been caught in a standoff, a situation that forced my partner, Andy, to take a shot when the suspect pulled a gun on us. I'd been only a witness, but until the investigation was done, we were both chained to our desks. The house was on my way back, so I figured I'd make a quick stop. Caroline had made a great roast the night before, and I thought I'd grab a sandwich for lunch. It was only a minor detour. No one at work would mind if I took a little extra time to finish my errand. As I rolled down our street, I parked across from Mrs. Doyle's place, taking a moment to admire her garden, still blooming with color even in the fall. I glanced toward our house, and that's when I noticed him, a man, casually strolling out our front door. It took me a moment to recognize him as Vince Taylor, a guy from a few blocks over known for his freelance IT work. Nice enough guy, I suppose, if a bit quiet. But what in the world was he doing coming out of my house in the middle of a workday? He glanced around, seemingly unaware of my presence as he crossed the street and rounded the corner. Unease crept over me as I pulled into the driveway. I walked inside, expecting the usual quiet, but I could hear the sound of the shower running upstairs. As I reached our bedroom, I noticed the bed, an unsettling mess of tangled sheets, pillows tossed every which way, and there, right in the center, was a damp spot, as if someone had been here only moments before. I could hear Caroline singing softly from the bathroom, one of her favorite tunes. She always did that when she was in a good mood. My stomach tightened. My first thought was impossible. Caroline was the most loyal person I knew. But that scene, the rumpled bed, her light-hearted humming. My mind was racing, anger simmering beneath the surface. I thought back to how we met, over 20 years ago. Caroline was working at a catering gig for a friend of my cousin's wedding. She wasn't flashy, not the type who turned heads the minute she entered a room, but she was magnetic in a subtle, compelling way that stuck with you. After a bit of small talk and some persistence, I got her number, and we started dating soon after. We'd been through it all together. The ups and downs, the kids, the crazy work schedules. We knew each other's habits, weaknesses, quirks. Or so I thought. Over the years, Caroline made her career in catering, balancing freelance gigs around raising our 2 daughters, Madeline and Erica. Madeline had graduated and moved out to Boston, and Erica was in her junior year at college. The girls were the best of us, thanks largely to Caroline's constant presence. As parents, we were solid. As partners, we'd grown comfortable. But there had always been that one lingering issue, our intimacy. She wasn't cold, but let's just say her level of interest in the bedroom didn't match mine. When we'd first been together, it was like any young couple, full of life and desire. But by the time we'd settled into marriage, it dwindled down to about once a week, maybe twice on a good stretch. I tried everything, but Caroline was content with the rare, casual approach, leaving me to hold on to hope that things would pick up once the kids were grown and out of the house. But when the day came, nothing really changed. If anything, our encounters felt more like an obligation she was fulfilling. I could feel her growing colder, more distant with each passing year. When I tried to reach out to her, she brushed me off, saying she was too tired or too busy. I thought it was just the toll of everyday life. I'd made my peace with it in a way. So, as I stood there in our bedroom, the bed in disarray and the shower still running, I felt anger bubbling up, a sharp, jagged feeling that I'd been foolish to let this go on. Was this how she had been spending her time? I waited, feeling the weight of my rage and disbelief until Caroline finally emerged from the bathroom, her face bright and oblivious, her hair wrapped up in a towel. She looked surprised to see me, her expression shifting quickly to a smile. "Oh, hey. I didn't expect you home this early," she said, crossing the room as though nothing were out of the ordinary. I forced myself to keep my tone steady. "Just thought I'd grab lunch," I replied, my eyes never leaving her face, searching for any hint of guilt or discomfort. But she gave nothing away. She moved past me, picking up a few scattered items from the floor as if it was just another day. I watched her carefully, my mind turning over questions I didn't want to ask. And yet, one kept creeping to the surface. Who the hell was Vince Taylor to her? I didn't confront Caroline that afternoon. I wasn't even sure what I'd say if I did. Instead, I let it fester, hoping I'd be able to put the pieces together before exploding into accusations. But the tension followed me back to work, gnawing away at my concentration. Every mundane task I worked on felt painfully slow, my mind looping back to Vince Taylor slipping out of my house. By the time I finally clocked out, I was wound so tight I thought I'd snap. That evening, we sat across from each other at dinner, the usual small talk filling the silence as I replayed the details over and over in my head. I tried to convince myself that maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe Vince had come over to help with some tech issue. Maybe Caroline's innocence was still intact. But I couldn't shake the image of that rumpled bed or the soft, cheerful way she'd been humming after a supposedly ordinary afternoon at home. Days passed, each one worse than the last, until the pressure finally got the better of me. Late one night, after we'd finished watching some TV show together, I leaned forward and asked the question that had been tearing me apart. "Caroline," I started, my voice even, "do you ever see Vince Taylor around the neighborhood?" She looked at me, her eyes widening just a fraction before she quickly regained her composure. "Vince? Oh, he's that computer guy, right? I think I've seen him a few times. Why?" It was an innocent enough answer, but I saw something flicker in her eyes, a hesitation, so brief most people would miss it. But I was a cop, trained to pick up on every micro-expression. There was something there, a flicker of discomfort that made my pulse quicken. "Just curious," I said, my voice as casual as I could manage. "You know, he's around here a lot, helping people with their tech stuff. Wasn't sure if he'd ever stopped by for anything." She shrugged, but her gaze drifted, landing anywhere but on me. "Maybe once or twice. He's good with computers, so he helped me with a software update a while back. Nothing big." She dropped her fork, her hand moving to clear the plates. She kept her face carefully blank, avoiding my gaze as she took the dishes to the sink. I nodded, not wanting to push her too far just yet. "Sounds helpful. Maybe I'll get him to look at the laptop in the den sometime. It's been acting up." As she stood by the sink, her shoulders tensed ever so slightly, and a dull ache gnawed at me. I knew Caroline inside out, or I thought I did. But this strange, guarded side of her, the way she avoided my eyes and moved like she was hiding something, it was new, and it felt wrong. The days continued in this uncomfortable silence. I'd watch her every move, noting any small sign of deception. There were little things, the kind you wouldn't pick up unless you were looking for them. A pause here, a half-smile there, moments of distant silence I hadn't noticed before. Each one added fuel to my suspicion. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was all in my head or if I was finally seeing the cracks in the marriage I'd once thought was rock solid. Finally, the breaking point came on a cold Wednesday evening. I'd been picking up dinner after my shift when I spotted Vince at a cafe near the precinct. He was sitting alone, absorbed in something on his phone. I couldn't shake the urge to confront him. I walked up to him, my presence causing him to look up, his expression neutral. He gave me a polite nod, though there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Hey, Vince," I said, keeping my tone light. "Mind if I join you?" He looked at me for a moment before gesturing to the seat across from him. "Sure, Rob. What's up?" I settled into the seat, studying his face. He looked relaxed, almost too relaxed, like someone with nothing to hide. "Just thought I'd ask you a question or two. You're the tech guy around the neighborhood, right?" "Yeah, that's me," he replied, shifting slightly in his seat. "People call me when their computers act up. Keeps me busy. Ever help Caroline with anything?" I asked, watching him closely. For a split second, his expression froze. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough for me to see that he was caught off guard. Yeah, I think so, he said slowly. She asked me to help with her laptop a few months back. Nothing major, just some updates. He avoided my eyes as he spoke, and I could feel my blood pressure rising. The lie was almost painful in its simplicity, like he was hoping I wouldn't press further. You just came by, did the update and left? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Vince nodded, forcing a smile. Yep, that's it. No big deal. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch between us, watching as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There was something off, and both of us could feel it. Finally, he cleared his throat, looking around as if searching for an escape. Well, I'd better get going, he said, gathering his things. Good to see you, Rob. I nodded, watching him leave, my gut twisted in knots. If Vince thought he could lie to me and walk away unscathed, he was wrong. I'd dealt with too many suspects to be fooled by a poorly crafted lie. He was hiding something, and the look in his eyes confirmed it. Back home, Caroline greeted me with the usual warmth, but I barely heard her. I was too busy planning my next move. I decided I wouldn't confront her directly. Not yet. Instead, I'd wait, see if she slipped up again. The truth, I knew, had a way of coming out on its own. The following weekend, I had a task to complete. I'd been avoiding it, reluctant to accept the implications of what I was doing, but my suspicions had grown too loud to ignore. With Caroline out for the morning, I decided to search the house, determined to find anything that could confirm or disprove my fears. I started in the den, where we kept the computer. Nothing seemed out of place, but I dug through every drawer, every folder. It felt wrong, like an invasion of privacy, but at this point, I was past caring about ethics. I was hunting for proof of what was happening under my own roof. After an hour of fruitless searching, I found myself in our bedroom. I opened the nightstand drawer, sifting through old cards, photos, random little notes we'd left each other over the years. Everything seemed innocent enough, but I knew better than to stop there. It was when I checked her phone that I found it. Tucked away in a messaging app, buried under conversations with friends and family, was a string of messages from Vince. Short, seemingly harmless, but there was an undertone there that made my stomach turn. I skimmed through them, my hand tightening around the phone as I read his replies to her. A casual, thanks for last time. A cryptic, can't wait to see you again. It was enough to confirm what I already knew. By the time Caroline returned, I was sitting in the living room, her phone on the table in front of me. She walked in, her smile faltering as she saw me waiting. Hey, everything okay? She asked, glancing between me and her phone. I nodded slowly, fixing her with a look that must have told her I knew. Sit down, Caroline. We need to talk. Caroline sat down, her face pale as she glanced between me and her phone on the table. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She reached for her phone, but I placed my hand over it, stopping her. I didn't have to say much. The look in my eyes told her that I already knew. Who is he, Caroline? My voice was calm, but the words came out like stone. She looked away, a hint of guilt flickering across her face. For a moment, I thought she'd deny it, weave some story to cover up what I'd already pieced together. But instead, she sighed, her shoulders slumping as if a weight had settled on them. It's Vince, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The name hung in the air, a confirmation of what I'd suspected all along. I sat back, letting the anger simmer, trying to keep control of myself. How long? I asked. Caroline swallowed, her gaze fixed on the floor. A couple of months. It was never supposed to go anywhere, Rob. I don't even know how it happened. I clenched my jaw, my fists tight at my sides. You know exactly how it happened. You invited him into our home, and you let this happen. And for what? A thrill? A bit of excitement? She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. Rob, I'm sorry. I know this sounds hollow, but I am. It was a mistake, and it meant nothing. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Nothing? So, you threw away 24 years of marriage, all for nothing? I guess that makes it all the better, then. She didn't respond, her silence doing more to confirm my fears than any excuse she might have made. I leaned forward, my voice dropping. Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I'd never notice the way you've been acting? Or did you think you were just so clever you'd get away with it? Each word came out cold and sharp, cutting through whatever excuse she might have been forming. Her lips trembled, and she finally whispered, I didn't want to hurt you, Rob. I didn't plan for any of this. So, what did you plan, Caroline? I snapped, leaning closer. To keep sneaking around behind my back, laughing with him while I went to work every day thinking my marriage was intact? She shook her head, fresh tears sliding down her face. No, Rob. I wanted to stop. I tried. But every time I'd think it was over, I'd see him around the neighborhood, and it just happened. I clenched my jaw, the anger boiling up again. It just happened. That's your excuse? You couldn't control yourself? Do you know how many times I've wanted to walk out that door when things got rough? But I stayed. I put in the work because I believed in us. Her shoulders shook as she began to cry, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of pity. But it vanished, replaced by the bitterness that had been eating at me for days. What about the girls, Caroline? Do they know the person their mother has become? You thought they'd never find out, I assume? She looked up, horror flashing across her face. Please, don't tell them. Rob, they don't need to know. This is between us. No, it's not just between us. You brought someone else into our home, our lives. Do you think they wouldn't want to know the truth? That their mother, the woman they've always admired, could betray her family like this? Please, she choked out, her hands trembling. Please, Rob, don't tell them. I'll do anything. Just don't take this from me. I still want to be their mother, their safe place. I made a mistake, but I can fix this. I stared at her, my anger dulled by a strange sense of resignation. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the Caroline I'd married. She was a stranger, someone who'd let lies and deceit take the place of the trust we'd built over 2 decades. And she thought that she could just patch things up, erase it like a mistake on a chalkboard. You can't fix this, Caroline, I said, my voice low. You've broken something that can't be repaired with an apology. Maybe you'll always be their mother, but you'll never be my wife again. Her face crumpled, and she looked away, her hands clutching at her shirt. I knew that look, the one she wore when she was trying to hold herself together. But it was too late for that. The damage was done. I stood up, the finality of the situation settling over me. I'll talk to the girls. I'll explain things in a way that won't hurt them more than it has to. But as for you and me, we're done. Caroline looked up, her expression desperate. Rob, please, don't do this. We've been together for so long. Don't throw it all away because of one mistake. I scoffed, shaking my head. You threw it away the moment you invited Vince into our home. The second you made the choice to betray me. This is the consequence of your mistake. I turned away, walking out of the room, her soft sobs trailing behind me. But I didn't stop. I didn't turn back. I'd made my choice, and for the first time in days, I felt a strange, twisted sense of relief. The days that followed were a blur of cold, quiet tension. Caroline and I barely spoke, each of us moving around the house like ghosts, careful not to cross paths. It was as though we were living in 2 separate worlds, mine filled with anger and disappointment, and hers, from what I could tell, filled with regret and silence. She didn't try to defend herself or push for reconciliation, knowing well enough that her words would fall flat. Our daughters, Madeline and Erica, had no idea about the storm brewing back home. Caroline begged me not to tell them, but I wasn't about to keep them in the dark forever. They had a right to know the truth, to understand why their lives were about to change. But I decided to do it in person. I owed them that much. I called Madeline first, arranging to meet her for lunch in Boston. She sounded thrilled, her excitement making the coming conversation all the more painful. When I arrived at the diner, she was already waiting, her face lighting up as I walked in. Hey, Dad, she greeted, wrapping me in a warm hug. We ordered, and she started chatting about work and her friends, her eyes full of life and optimism. I sat there, nodding, offering polite smiles, but I was barely listening, my mind racing with how to break the news without tearing her world apart. After a while, she paused, her smile fading as she noticed my distracted expression. Dad, is everything okay? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Maddie, there's something I need to tell you. It's about your mom and me. Her face fell, the light in her eyes dimming as she seemed to brace herself. What happened? I took her hand, keeping my voice as steady as I could. Your mom and I are separating. I found out she's been unfaithful. It's been going on for a while. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and irreversible. Madeline's eyes widened, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. What, Mom? Are you sure? I nodded, the weight of the truth settling between us. I didn't want to believe it either, but I've seen the proof. She betrayed our marriage, Maddie, and as much as I'd like to ignore it, I can't. She looked away, her jaw clenched, her eyes welling with tears. I don't understand. I thought you two were happy. I thought we were a strong family. So did I said softly, my voice thick with regret. But some things happen that you can't just undo. Some lines, once crossed, leave no way back. Madeline wiped at her tears, her expression hardening. Are you going to tell Erica? Yes, I replied. I'll see her this weekend, and I'll tell her, just like I'm telling you now. I don't want either of you to hear it from anyone else. You deserve to know the truth. She nodded, though I could see the struggle in her eyes as she tried to process the reality of her parents' separation. Thanks, Dad. I appreciate you being honest with us. We spent the rest of the meal in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When it was finally time to leave, she hugged me tightly, and I could feel the tremor in her arms as she held on a little longer than usual. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the sense of loss, knowing I just shattered her perception of our family. The following weekend, I made the trip to Erica's college. She greeted me with the same enthusiasm Madeline had, unaware of what I was about to tell her. We found a quiet spot in a nearby park, and as I broke the news, I watched her face fall, the confusion and pain in her eyes mirroring her sister's reaction. Dad, I don't even know what to say, she murmured, looking away as tears spilled down her cheeks. I thought you and Mom were solid. I never imagined. I placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. I know, sweetheart. I never imagined it either. But sometimes people do things that can't be explained, things that hurt the ones they're supposed to care about the most. And your mom, she made a choice. She nodded, wiping her tears. Are you okay, Dad? I forced a weak smile, nodding. I will be. Right now, I'm just focused on doing what's best for you and your sister. We spent the rest of the day together, and though she tried to put on a brave face, I could see the sadness in her eyes. By the time I left, I felt drained, the weight of my daughter's pain adding to the heavy burden of betrayal I carried. Back home, I found Caroline sitting in the living room, her face pale as she glanced up at me. Did you tell them? Yes, I said, my tone cold. They know, and they're heartbroken. You can thank yourself for that. She looked down, her shoulders trembling. I never wanted this, Rob. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Maybe not, but you did, I replied, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. And now you have to live with that. Our family isn't something you can just erase and rebuild. You tore it apart, and there's no going back. We didn't speak after that. Over the next week, I put the final touches on the paperwork for our separation, arranging for a lawyer to draft the necessary documents. With the girls out of the house, there were no custody battles, no complications. Just the cold, clinical task of dividing what had once been our life. The day she moved out, I watched her load her things into the car, her face pale and hollow, a shadow of the woman I'd once loved. She glanced back at me, her eyes pleading, but I gave her nothing. No sympathy, no forgiveness. She'd made her bed, and now she'd have to lie in it. When she finally drove away, I stood in the driveway, the silence around me as heavy as the ache in my chest. The house felt empty, and for the first time, I felt the weight of my decisions settle over me. I was alone, left with the remnants of a broken marriage and a family torn apart. As I walked back inside, I made a vow to myself. I would rebuild, for the sake of my daughters, for the sake of the life I'd worked so hard to create. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never let anyone take advantage of my trust again. After Caroline left, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Every room felt like an echo of what we'd once had. A shared life that had dissolved into a handful of empty spaces and haunting memories. I tried to keep busy, filling my time with work and the projects I'd neglected around the house. But no matter how many hours I put in or how many distractions I found, the silence remained, pressing down on me, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Madeline and Erica checked in often. At first, their calls were strained, each one careful with their words, tiptoeing around the subject of their mother. But over time, as the months passed, the calls grew more relaxed, and they even began to open up about how they were processing everything. They were angry, of course, but they'd started to come to terms with it in their own way. I could tell they were stronger than I'd given them credit for, and it was their resilience that helped me keep moving forward. One evening, a few months later, I was cleaning out the garage when I stumbled across a dusty old box of photo albums. I hadn't looked at these pictures in years. There were photos from our wedding, vacations, the girls' childhoods, images of smiles and laughter, all of us blissfully unaware of what was to come. For a moment, I considered tossing them, ridding myself of any last trace of Caroline. But something stopped me. I flipped through the pages, seeing the memories we'd made, the life we'd built together. And I realized that while the betrayal was fresh, these moments were still real. The love I'd had for her, the life we'd built, didn't vanish because of her choices. Those years were a part of me, a part of my story, and nothing could erase them. So I closed the album, setting it aside with a quiet resolve. I would keep these memories, not for her, but for myself and for the daughters we'd raised. Life took on a new rhythm. I threw myself into my work at the precinct, volunteering for more shifts, keeping myself occupied. When I wasn't working, I'd visit Madeline in Boston or take Erica out for lunch when she was home from college. Slowly, I was finding my way back, learning to live without the weight of betrayal hanging over me. It was a long process, filled with moments of doubt and anger, but each day, I felt myself getting a little bit stronger. One evening, about a year after Caroline had left, I ran into an old friend, Tom, at a neighborhood gathering. Tom had been through a rough divorce himself a few years back, and he understood the toll it took. We got to talking, sharing stories over a couple of beers. He told me about his experience of picking up the pieces, how he'd rebuilt his life one day at a time, never letting the bitterness consume him. I could see a glimmer of hope in his words, a reminder that there was life beyond the pain, a future waiting on the other side. "Let me tell you something," he said, slapping me on the back with a grin. "It's rough as hell, but one day, you'll wake up and realize that it doesn't hurt like it used to. And that's when you'll know you're free." Those words stuck with me. Each day after that, I worked a little harder to let go of the anger, to focus on what lay ahead instead of the wreckage left behind. And slowly, I began to see the truth in Tom's words. I started feeling lighter, the bitterness loosening its grip, replaced by a cautious hope. It was around this time that I met someone new. Her name was Laura, and we crossed paths through a mutual friend at a neighborhood barbecue. She was kind, with a warm smile and a laugh that felt like a breath of fresh air. We started off slow, as friends, sharing stories and laughter, learning about each other's pasts, our dreams, our scars. She, too, had been through her share of heartache, and in that shared understanding, we found a quiet connection. I took my time, not wanting to rush, not wanting to let old wounds cloud a new chapter. And Laura, patient and understanding, gave me the space I needed to heal. Over the months, I felt myself opening up again, bit by bit, trusting in the idea of love without the weight of betrayal. One evening, as we sat on my back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in years. She reached over, taking my hand in hers, and I realized that the anger, the bitterness, had finally faded. In its place was something new, something soft and hopeful. Looking back now, I see that betrayal had nearly torn me apart, had almost left me hollow and closed off. But with time and the love of my daughters, the support of friends, and the courage to let someone new into my life, I found my way through it. And for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to what lay ahead, to the life I'd rebuilt from the ashes of what had been. As I watched the sun set that evening, Laura beside me, I took a deep breath, feeling the peace settle within me. I was no longer defined by the pain of the past, no longer haunted by the betrayal that had once overshadowed everything. I'd come out the other side, stronger and ready to embrace the life waiting for me. And with that, I let go, ready to begin again. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.